This part 1 video is a redo of my July 31, 2023 video on affirmative action because I found a couple of errors in the data. It discusses my views on the US Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in college admissions and other affirmative action programs in general. Hello friends, this is Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini, where I provide unique analysis of world events based on the unmasked truth that after surrender, Germany continued World War II clandestinely and became a killing machine. I also provide true news that you will find nowhere else. On June 29, 2023, the US Supreme Court struck down affirmative action programs at the University of North Carolina and Harvard in consideration of race in the admissions process. The court ruled that both programs were unlawful because they violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. In the majority opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that both programs, the Harvard and the UNC admissions programs, cannot be reconciled with the guarantees of the Equal Protection Clause. Both programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. We have never permitted admissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. With this decision, the court overturned a more than 40-year precedent dating back to 1978 when it upheld limited consideration of race in university admissions to counter the effects of historic discrimination against African Americans and other minority groups. The court decision also effectively overturned its 2003 ruling in Grutter versus Bollinger, in which it said colleges could consider race as a factor in the admissions process because they had a compelling interest in maintaining diverse campuses. First, let's consider some statistics. How does the American adult population feel about this issue? Here are the results from a Pew Research survey on this issue. Half of US adults say they disapprove of selective colleges and universities taking prospective students' racial and ethnic backgrounds into account when making admissions decisions. Fewer, 33%, approve of colleges considering race and ethnicity to increase diversity at the schools, while 16% are not sure. Nearly half of black Americans, that's 47%, say they approve of colleges and universities considering prospective students' racial and ethnic backgrounds when making admissions decisions, compared with 29% who disapprove. 24% are not sure. Among Hispanic Americans, identical shares approve and disapprove of these practices, 39% each. Both white and Asian Americans are more likely to disapprove of colleges doing this, 57% of white adults and 52% of Asian adults, than to approve, thus 29% and 37% respectively. Thus, a majority of the US adult population disapproves of these practices. Not only a majority of the African Americans, Hispanic, or Asian populations approve of these practices. Not even a majority of the African American, Hispanic, or Asian populations approve of these practices, but a significant minority does approve of them, and they are vocal and a significant voting bloc. White or minority politicians from communities with significant minority populations must appear to their constituents to be fighting specifically to wrest more benefits for them or get a bigger share of the national economic pie for them. Affirmative action programs fit that bill perfectly. I'm not saying that affirmative action programs were totally unjustified to begin with. Segregation would not have provided equal opportunity for all. Desegregation took care of that problem. At the same time, affirmative action programs that began in the 1960s brought African Americans and all minorities into the mainstream of American life. After nearly 3 generations since then, all minorities have made great gains towards achieving some degree of prosperity. Here is the median household income by race for 2021. All races and ethnicities, $70,784. Asian, $101,418. White, not Hispanic, $77,999. Hispanic, any race, $57,981. And Black Americans, $48,297. These figures are for household income. I worked for 7.5 years for the Florida Department of Children and Families, which is its welfare department. To receive food stamps, cash assistance, and Medicaid benefits, many intact African American Hispanic families deliberately split the household to qualify for benefits. Therefore, their total household income is split up into two households. Of course, there is also a minority of intact households among African Americans, which means only 43%. Therefore, the true household income for African American and Hispanic would be somewhere between the household income for white, not Hispanic households and their respective incomes, but less than the household income for all households. Just to illustrate, the true household income for African American households would be between 77,999 and 48,297, or say somewhere around 56,000 to 60,000. That would be supplemented by food stamps, cash assistance, and Medicaid benefits for some of the population. Therefore, disparities in income between different ethnic groups are less than what the statistics indicate. Clearly, all minorities have made substantial gains since the introduction of affirmative action programs about 6 days or nearly 3 generations ago. There is also the problem of single parent households among African Americans and Hispanics primarily, though that problem exists among whites as well. It is a well established fact that there is insignificant poverty among intact households among African Americans as well as Hispanics. Making bad lifestyle choices leads to poor outcomes. In 2021, nearly 30% of single parents lived in poverty, while just 6% of married couples fit the same statistic. In 2022, the majority of white children and Hispanic children lived in two parent homes, 75.6% and 67.5% respectively, compared with 4 and 10 or 43% black children. The poor outcomes in such families are not due to racial discrimination, but all politicians who wish to garner the votes of such households and the NAACP and other minority advocacy organizations will bang the drum of discrimination being the cause of disparities as loudly as possible. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing in the 2003 Grutter versus Bollinger ruling, anticipated that affirmative action programs should no longer be needed by 2028. Conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in a concurring opinion, said that the June 29, 2023 Supreme Court ruling would apply first to those starting college in 2028, and that the decision therefore did not conflict with the 2003 ruling. Therefore, the question to consider is whether race-based college admissions to colleges should be continued beyond the 2028 starting years. Another question is, will the U.S. Supreme Court decision affect African Americans or Hispanics or other minorities so much that relatively few as compared to today will be able to get a college education? The answer is not at all. According to NPR.com, the ruling mainly affects a select number of colleges. There are nearly 4,000 colleges and universities in the U.S., and only a small portion, slightly more than 200, have highly selective admissions where fewer than 50% of applicants get in. That's just over 200 schools where the ruling on a race-conscious admissions process could make a significant difference. Even among these 200, there are only dozens of highly competitive elite colleges that take race into account, such as Harvard, Yale, Brown, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, and Dartmouth College, that would be affected by the decision. Thus, very few students would be affected by the Supreme Court decision. Any minority student who wants a college education has plenty of good alternatives available in the other 4,000 colleges and universities in America. Granted that a degree from an elite college is an advantage for entry into employment at top government and private industry organizations. That's why there is so much competition for entry into such colleges. The competition for admission to such colleges should be free and fair based on merit. So, why should anyone receive preferential treatment for admissions into such colleges? Of course, the question is, will minorities be discriminated against if the protection of affirmative action is removed? Not according to the statements of the heads of the two elite institutions involved in the lawsuit. UNC Chancellor Kevin Guskiewicz stated that the university remains firmly committed to bringing together talented students from different perspectives and life experiences and continues to make an affordable, high quality education accessible to the people of North Carolina and beyond. Harvard leaders issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to the fundamental principle that deep and transformative teaching, learning, and research depend upon a community comprising people of many backgrounds, perspectives, and lived experiences. Harvard will now determine how to preserve, consistent with the court's new precedent, our essential values. The leaders of the elite institutions are committed to a diverse student body to enrich the learning experience. They'll find a way to ensure that and develop new admissions processes in response to the Supreme Court ruling. In a New York Times article, Professor Dr. Tyler Austin Harper, an African American assistant professor of environmental studies at Bates College in a New York Times article wrote, he described the admissions process in elite colleges as gamification. According to Dr. Harper, each student is left with the unenviable task of figuring out what is in the mind of the admissions officer. They had to guess what would maximize the chances of being admitted and project themselves that way in their application. He states, the Chinese and Korean kids wanted to know how to make their application materials seem less Chinese or Korean. The rich white kids wanted to know ways to seem less rich and less white. The black kids wanted to make sure they came across as black enough. Ditto for the Latino and Middle Eastern kids. Seemingly everyone I interacted with, Professor Harper continues, with as a tutor, white or brown, rich or poor, student or parent, believed that getting into an elite college required what I came to call racial gamification. For these students, the college admissions process had been reduced to performance art in which they were tasked with either minimizing or maximizing their racial identity in exchange for the reward of a proverbial thick envelope from their dream school, be it for an acceptance letter or a tenure-track professorship. The incentives at elite universities encourage and reward racial gamification. Such gamification in the admissions process in elite colleges will go on, with admissions officers at universities and students and parents adjusting according to the Supreme Court decision. What would be the likely short-term effect? Data from the University of California system indicates that when it banned the use of race in admissions in 1996, the number of black students went down from 7% in 1996 to 2% today. The University of Michigan passed similar laws in 2006. Black student enrollment was 7% at that time and went down to 4% in 2021. Is that prima facie evidence of racial discrimination? Hardly. Asians are racial minorities too. If there was racial discrimination, their enrollment at elite institutions should be going down too. But they are instead complaining of reverse discrimination because their enrollment is increasing, but fear it will be curtailed. In a breakdown of the incoming class of 2023, Harvard revealed that 29.9% of admitted students are Asian American, while they constitute only 6.3% of the US population, and that is a 2.1% jump from last year's number. The simple fact is that Asian Americans are highly competitive. The reason is that only some of the best educated in their countries have been admitted into the United States. They're able to better educate their children, which enables them to be admitted into elite institutions. The way for other minorities to be admitted into elite institutions is to compete as hard as them. But don't expect to be admitted into elite institutions as the same percentage of a national population. The right comparison would be the number of students admitted into elite institutions when compared to the same number of education and income level of the parents from each community. We will probably find that there are not many differences between the races. Again, in the short term, there could be a reduction in the number of some minorities admitted into elite institutions, though that is not a given in light of the fact that university leaders are still fully committed to diversity in the student body. But that too does not mean they will be denied a university education. There are plenty of other colleges in which they should be able to get admission. Additionally, they have the example of Asian Americans who are successful in getting admission into elite institutions. They should emulate their example and do the things that make them successful. They should adjust to the new reality and compete for admission into elite institutions fair and square like everyone else. Fair and square admissions process also requires that legacy admissions based on alumni status of parents or donations to the university should also end. The best advice I have found for any minority is that given by Professor Harper at Bates College in his New York Times article mentioned earlier. He writes, "As for students, what advice would I give if I were tutoring again, sitting across from talented brown or black kids worried that the Supreme Court has just made it easier to keep them out of the school of their dreams? Remember that racial gamification is just that, a game. Ignore anyone who would have you believe that attending Ivy League universities with their endowments as large as a reasonably sized country's nominal GDP is the only path to happiness or success or racial equality. Civil rights leaders did not endure the dogs and the cold baptism of the fire hoses in the hopes that one day their children's children could become Ivy minted venture capitalists and management consultants. Remember that Martin Luther King Jr. did not dream of a multiracial oligarchy, and that the vaults of opportunity of which he spoke of are not hidden only behind a golden door at Yale University. There are other paths to life that do not require gaming anything. Remember that hope is wherever you find yourself." To be more specific, I will reiterate my advice given to African Americans 27 to 28 years ago. African Americans and Hispanics each constitute a large part of the U.S. economy. The Hispanic American spending or purchasing power grew to $1.9 trillion in 2020, an increase of 87% from 2010. The buying power of African Americans rose to 1.6 trillion or 9% of the nation's total buying power, an increase of 61% over 2010. The combined buying power of U.S. consumers grew from $11.3 trillion to $17.5 trillion between 2010 and 2020, or by 55%. Almost 21 million Asian Americans, including Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, represent 6.3% of the U.S. population. The group's buying power is $1.3 trillion. Unfortunately, I could not find separate data for contribution to U.S. GDP by African Americans and Hispanics, so I used an approximation for illustrative purposes. U.S. GDP in 2020 was $20.93 trillion. Note, there can be minor differences in GDP depending on the source, such as the World Bank, IMF, or another agency. My source for this data is https statistics.times.com, and purchasing power of the U.S. consumer was $17.5 trillion. Using the same ratio of GDP to purchasing power for African Americans with purchasing power of 1.6 trillion, their position of GDP works out to $1.914 trillion or 20.93 divided by 17.5 into 1.6. For Hispanics, it is $2.27 trillion, which is 20.93 divided by 7.5 into 1.9. IMF GDP data for 2020 shows the GDP of top 10 economies in 2020 has the US 20.93 trillion, China 14.72 trillion, Japan 5.05 trillion, Germany 3.80 trillion, UK 2.71 trillion, India 2.708 trillion, France 2.6 trillion, Italy 1.887 trillion, Canada 1.64 trillion, and South Korea 1.63 trillion. Thus, data comparison with IMF GDP data by country for 2020 shows that if American Hispanics were a separate country, they would be the 8th largest economy in the world, and African Americans would be just behind them and ahead of Italy. The only economies ahead of them would be the USA, China, Japan, Germany, UK, India, and France. The advice I gave to African Americans 27 to 28 years ago was that they should buy products and services from each other. That way they can bypass much, if any, discrimination. They participate in other parts of the economy by getting jobs in industries and owning equity in stocks of the corporations they want, of any corporation they want. They listen to my advice and have made incredible gains in the 27 to 28 years since I gave that advice, though they may not credit me for it. Many have become billionaires and multimillionaires. The key to becoming wealthy is entrepreneurship, and minorities have an enormous consumer base to work with. Lawyers and other professionals such as doctors, dentists, accountants, and other professions become wealthy. No minorities are lagging behind on that score. Entrepreneurship does not require a college degree from an Ivy school or a college degree at all. There is no need to rely on the crutch of affirmative action to become wealthy, as Dr. Harper's advice implies. Merit should drive who gets admission into what institution and then employment after that. How ridiculous does it sound to talk about affirmative action in sports? The percentage of black or African American National Football League players in 2020 was 57.5%, whites 24.9%, Hispanics or Latinos 0.4%, Asians 0.1%, Pacific Islanders 1.6%, and American Indians 0.2%. 9.4% of players identified as two or more races. The NBA in 2020, instead of 73.2% black players, 16.8% white players, 3.1% Latino players of any race, and 0.4% Asian players. Additionally, 6.6% of the players were classified as either multiracial or other races. Hispanics and African Americans have made gains in employment in the entertainment industry, journalism, and law enforcement, so that they are now represented close to their percentages of national population in these in these categories. If affirmative action in sports sounds ridiculous, race-based admissions into elite institutions should sound equally ridiculous, now that all minorities have been brought into the mainstream of American economic life. Thus, after 60 years of affirmative action, the program should end. I agree with the U.S. Supreme Court decision regarding consideration of race in the admissions process in colleges. No American should be given preferential treatment. Justice Clarence Thomas said it well in his 58-page concurring opinion to the Supreme Court decision that the programs in question are rudderless race-based preferences designed to ensure a particular racial mix in the entering classes. Both policies fly in the face of our combined colorblind constitution and our nation's equality ideal. He added, while I am painfully aware of the social and economic ravages which have befallen my race and all who suffer discrimination, I hold out enduring hope that this country will live up to its principles so clearly enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States that all men are created equal, are equal citizens, and must be treated equally before the law. In part 2 video, I'll compare the US affirmative action programs to similar programs in India and how it affects Indian society and the lessons America can learn from it. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please continue to watch my videos and read my articles on important world events, World War III watch, politics, international business, advice on health and medical problems, and much more for in-depth and insightful analysis. Please also subscribe to my YouTube and Facebook channels Unmasked Truth with Harmanjit Saini to view and get information on the latest videos.